The first time I saw my ex-husband smile at his own wedding, I realized grief doesn't always come from what you lose. Sometimes it comes from what you finally understand. I was standing at the back of a church I never thought I'd step into again, my hands folded so tightly my knuckles had gone pale. The air smelled like fresh lilies and old wood polish. Somewhere near the altar, a violin trembled through a love song I used to hum while washing dishes. And there he was, Daniel, in a gray suit that fit him better than the vows he'd once promised me. He looked lighter, unburdened, as if the years we spent building a life together had been something he could simply shrug off, like an old coat left behind at a thrift store. I wasn't invited, not really. My name wasn't on any cream-colored envelope, but when you spend 23 years married to a man, you don't need an invitation to know where he'll be on his wedding day or who he'll be marrying. What I didn't know, not then, was that before the day was over, a man would walk into that church and quietly unravel everything Daniel thought he'd escaped. But that came later. Before betrayal has a face, it has a rhythm, and ours used to be gentle. Daniel and I met when I was 26 and convinced love was something loud and dramatic. He was calm in a way that felt safe. We married young enough to believe effort alone could fix anything, and for a long time it almost did. We built a modest life, a 2-story house with creaky stairs and a maple tree that dropped leaves like it was shedding secrets every fall. Saturday mornings were for burnt toast and overbrewed coffee. He liked his eggs soft. I liked mine firm. We argued about nothing important and laughed about things no one else found funny. I worked as a financial administrator for a mid-sized construction firm. Numbers made sense to me. They stayed where you put them if you paid attention. Daniel ran a small logistics business. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady, or so I thought. Because I handled the books at work, I naturally took care of our finances too. Not because Daniel couldn't, but because he trusted me, or at least he used to say he did. Every bill, every investment, every emergency fund, it all flowed through my careful hands. I didn't hide anything from him. I explained, asked, double-checked. He nodded along, grateful to be free from the details. "You're good at this," he'd say, kissing my forehead as I balanced spreadsheets at the dining table. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Back then, I believed him. Our daughter, Claire, had moved out by the time the marriage began to change. She was starting her own life, busy enough not to notice the quiet shifts at home, the kind of shifts that don't slam doors, they close them softly until one day you realize the room is sealed shut. Daniel started coming home later. Nothing outrageous, just an hour here, a dinner missed there. He blamed clients, traffic, exhaustion. His phone stayed face down on the counter, always within reach. When it buzzed, he'd glance at the screen before deciding whether to answer. I told myself not to be that woman, the suspicious one, the one who reads meaning into silence. Still, I noticed the way he stopped asking about my day, the way our conversations became transactional, who would pick up milk, whether the roof still leaked, when Claire was coming to visit. Intimacy thinned like soup stretched too far. One night, as we lay in bed, the ceiling fan clicking overhead, I reached for his hand. He let me take it, but his fingers stayed stiff in mine. "You okay?" I asked. "Just tired," he said, turning toward the wall. Tired, I learned, can mean many things. The first real crack came quietly, almost politely. I was reviewing our joint accounts one afternoon, something I did every month without fail, when I noticed a small but consistent transfer I didn't recognize. Not large enough to cause alarm, just enough to nag at the back of my mind. I stared at the screen, then at the clock. 4 o'clock. Daniel wouldn't be home for hours. When I asked him about it that evening, I kept my voice casual, neutral. "Oh, that?" he said, barely looking up from his plate. "Business expense, temporary." "Which client?" I asked. He shrugged. "I'll explain later. It's nothing." Later never came. The transfers continued, the explanations didn't. And then there was her. I didn't know her name at first, only the faint trace of a floral perfume that wasn't mine, clinging to his jacket, only the way he smiled at messages he didn't share, only the sudden interest in his appearance, new shirts, new shoes, cologne he'd once said was too much. I watched him carefully after that, like someone studying weather patterns for a storm they hope won't form. I told myself love meant trust. But trust, I learned, also means noticing when someone stops being careful with your heart. The night Daniel told me he wanted a divorce, it was raining, the kind of rain that sounds like static against the windows. "I'm not happy anymore," he said, sitting across from me at the cable where I'd balanced our lives for decades. I waited for more. There was always more. "There's someone else," he added finally. His voice wasn't cruel, it was resigned, as if he were confessing to a habit he couldn't break. I didn't cry, not then. I asked practical questions, timelines, logistics. He seemed surprised by my calm, mistaking it for acceptance. What he didn't understand was this. I had spent my life paying attention to details, and when someone underestimates a woman who knows exactly where every dollar goes, they usually regret it. But regret, like justice, has its own timing, and Daniel's wedding day was only the beginning. After Daniel said the words, "There's someone else," the room didn't explode the way movies teach us to expect. No shouting, no thrown lasses, just the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the steady rain tapping against the window like it was counting down something I couldn't yet see. "Who is she?" I asked. He hesitated, just a fraction too long. "Her name is Lila," he said. "She works with one of my clients. It wasn't planned." It never is, according to the people who do the leaving. I nodded once, as if he told me we were out of sugar. Inside, something folded in on itself. Not shattered, folded, like a carefully kept letter being put away forever. "How long?" I asked. "A few months." A few months. Long enough to practice lies, long enough to move money quietly, long enough to decide I was already gone. He didn't apologize the way I expected. There was no trembling remorse, no begging for forgiveness, just a tired certainty, like he'd rehearsed this conversation in his car before coming inside. "I want to do this cleanly," he said, "fairly." Fair. That word stayed with me. The divorce moved quickly, too quickly for a marriage that had taken over 2 decades to build. Daniel hired a lawyer recommended by Lila, though he didn't tell me that part outright. I found out later, in the way you always do, by noticing patterns. We sat across from each other in conference rooms that smelled like stale coffee and copy paper. He avoided my eyes. I kept my voice steady. The house went to me. That was non-negotiable. Claire's childhood was built into those walls. Daniel agreed without much resistance, which should have been my first warning. His business accounts were complicated. He insisted they were separate, that the transfers I'd noticed were unrelated to me. His lawyer spoke smoothly, quickly, as if hoping momentum would carry the truth right past us. I didn't argue then. I listened. When you've worked with numbers long enough, you know when someone is rushing because they don't want you to look too closely. By the time the papers were signed, Daniel was already living somewhere else, a rental across town. Temporary, he said. "Until things settle," he told Claire, who stood in my kitchen gripping her mug like it might crack. She was angry in a quiet way, sharp, controlled, the way only daughters can be when they're disappointed in their fathers. "I can't believe he did this," she said after he left. "After everything." I put my hand over hers. "People don't leave because of one thing," I said. "They leave because of who they decide to become." That night, I cried alone in the bedroom that no longer smelled like him. Grief came in waves, not just for the man I'd lost, but for the woman I'd been when I believed love meant permanence. The months after the divorce were strangely peaceful, Painful, yes, but also quiet. I learned how to sleep diagonally across the bed. I learned how silence could be both a comfort and a threat. Daniel called occasionally, usually about logistics, insurance forms, tax questions. He still spoke to me like he was my safety net, forgetting he'd cut the rope himself. Then, one afternoon, I received an email notification from the bank, a courtesy alert I'd set up years ago and forgotten about. It was for an account I didn't recognize at first. Then I did. It was an old joint business account Daniel and I had opened early in our marriage, back when his business was still small and my credit helped secure its first line of funding. We'd agreed, long ago, to leave it dormant unless absolutely necessary. Apparently, Daniel had decided necessary was a flexible term. I stared at the screen as recent transactions populated one by one. Transfers, withdrawals, payments, some labeled vaguely, others not at all. My name was still on that account. My signature still mattered. I felt something cold settle in my chest. When I called the bank, the representative's voice was cheerful, oblivious. "Yes, ma'am, the account has been quite active recently." "Who authorized the transactions?" I asked. "There are 2 authorized signatories, you and Mr. Harris." I thanked her and hung up. Then I sat very still. This wasn't just betrayal anymore. This was carelessness or arrogance. Daniel assumed I was done paying attention. I didn't confront him right away. Instead, I did what I'd always done best. I gathered information. Over the next few weeks, I traced patterns, money moving in small, careful amounts, nothing flashy, enough to fund something new without triggering alarms. A wedding, perhaps? The realization came to me slowly, like dawn through fog. Daniel wasn't just starting over with Lila, he was using pieces of the life we'd built to do it. I found her on social media one evening. It wasn't hard. Her profile picture showed a woman in her late 30s, smiling too brightly, arm looped through Daniel's at what looked like a vineyard. Engaged. The caption read, "New beginnings." I closed the app and stared at the dark reflection of myself in the phone screen. I didn't look angry. I looked resolved. If Daniel wanted a clean break, he shouldn't have dragged my name or my finances into his new life. When I finally called him, my voice was calm enough to scare even myself. "You've been using the old joint account," I said. Silence, then a sigh. "It was easier," he replied. "I meant to tell you." "After the wedding?" I asked. Another pause. "So you know," he said. "I know," I replied. "And it stops now." He laughed, a short, disbelieving sound. "Come on, it's not hurting you." That was when I realized he truly didn't understand what he'd done. "It's hurting your future," I said quietly. "What does that mean?" he asked. "It means that the finances you've been leaning on are no longer available to you." I gave him a deadline, 30 days to disentangle himself completely, to move every account, to repay what he'd taken under my name. "You wouldn't, after everything." "After everything." I would, and I am. The paperwork wasn't dramatic. No courtrooms, no raised voices, just forms, signatures, and phone calls. I removed my name, froze access, notified the bank of unauthorized use beyond our divorce agreement. I didn't take more than what was mine. I didn't touch his primary business accounts. I simply closed the door he assumed would stay open forever. The day I finished, I felt lighter than I had in months. 2 weeks later, Claire called me. "Mom, did you know Daniel's wedding is in 3 weeks?" "I did," I replied. "There's something else," she added. "He sounds stressed, like something's wrong." I smiled, though she couldn't see it. Some lessons arrive wrapped in silk, others come dressed as consequences. Daniel called that night. His voice was tight. "You didn't have to do this," he said. "I did," I replied. There was anger then, accusations. He said I was being vindictive, that I was trying to punish him for leaving. No, I said, I'm responding to what you did after you left. He hung up on me. I slept better than I had in weeks. The morning of Daniel's wedding arrived bright and clear, too beautiful for the weight it carried. I didn't plan to go, not at first, but something told me to be nearby, not out of bitterness, but for closure. I dressed simply, nothing that drew attention, parked a block away from the church, sat in my car, and listened to the bells begin to ring. I thought that would be the end of it. I didn't know a man would walk through those church doors with questions Daniel couldn't answer. I didn't know the truth would arrive with its own witness, and I didn't know that by the end of the day, Daniel's new beginning would look very different from the one he'd imagined. I was still sitting in my car when I saw him. He didn't look like a guest. He wasn't dressed for celebration, no boutonniere, no polished shoes. He wore a dark jacket that had seen better days and held a folded envelope in his hand like it weighed something, like it mattered. He stood on the steps of the church, hesitating, scanning the faces of people entering. His eyes moved carefully, deliberately, until they landed on Daniel. Even from a distance, I recognized the shift in Daniel's posture, the way his shoulders stiffened, the way his smile faltered just slightly, as if a memory had walked in uninvited. The man approached him, spoke quietly. Daniel shook his head at first. Then the man said something else, something that made Daniel's face drain of color. I opened my car door before I realized I'd decided to. Inside the church, the air buzzed with hushed excitement. Guests murmured, programs rustled. I slipped into a seat near the back, heart beating louder than the organ warming up. The man stood near the aisle now, speaking to an usher who looked uncertain. Daniel approached again, his voice low but urgent. "This is not the time," Daniel hissed. The man didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "It's never the time when people are lying," he said. That was when Leela appeared. She looked exactly like her pictures, poised, glowing, dressed in white that seemed too pristine for the truth it covered. She took in the scene with confusion, then concern. "Daniel?" she asked. "What's going on?" The man turned to her, studied her face. Something like pity crossed his features. "You must be Leela," he said. "I'm Mark." Daniel stepped between them. "This is a private matter." Mark's eyes flicked to the guests, the altar, the priest waiting patiently at the front. "So is marriage," he replied. A ripple of unease moved through the room. I didn't know Mark then, not personally, but as I watched him stand there, calm and unwavering, I understood something important. Truth doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it walks in quietly and waits for someone to stop pretending. Leela looked from Mark to Daniel. "Who is he?" she asked. Daniel swallowed. "No one." Mark smiled sadly. "That's not how I'd describe myself." He reached into the envelope and pulled out a single sheet of paper, held it up between them. "I'm the co-signer," he said, "on the loan you've been defaulting on." The word defaulting echoed like a dropped plate. Daniel's eyes widened. "This is not the place." "This is exactly the place," Mark said, "because this wedding is being paid for with money you don't have." A murmur spread through the pews. I felt my breath catch, not in triumph, but in something quieter, validation. Leela's voice trembled. "Daniel, what is he talking about?" Daniel's jaw tightened. "It's complicated." Mark shook his head. "It's simple. You took out a loan 6 months ago to cover expenses. You said your ex-wife was still backing the accounts, that funds would clear." His gaze shifted briefly to the back of the church. Our eyes met. I didn't look away. "They didn't," Mark continued, "and now the bank wants answers." The priest cleared his throat gently. "Perhaps we should step outside." But Leela didn't move. "You told me everything was paid for," she said. "You said your finances were solid." "They were," he snapped, "until she—" He stopped himself. Too late. Leela turned slowly, followed his gaze. When she saw me, something changed in her expression. Recognition, not of my face, but of my role. "You're the ex-wife," she said. I stood then. My legs felt steady. "Yes," I replied, "I am." The room went very quiet. I didn't speak to accuse. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I removed myself from accounts that still had my name on, accounts I was no longer legally responsible for. Mark nodded, which left Daniel fully liable. Leela's eyes filled with tears. "You told me she was vindictive," she whispered to Daniel. "You said she was trying to hurt us." Daniel looked cornered now, small. "I told you she cut me off. I didn't say why." Leela laughed, a brittle, disbelieving sound. "You didn't say because you were using her credit to fund our life." She took a step back. I watched her then, really watched her, not as an enemy, as a woman realizing the ground beneath her wasn't solid. "I didn't know," she said to me, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know," I replied, and I meant it. The wedding didn't end with shouting, it ended with silence. Guests stood uncertainly, programs forgotten in their laps. The priest stepped aside, the organ fell quiet. Mark handed Daniel the paper. "You have until Monday, then I protect myself." Daniel didn't respond. Leela removed her engagement ring slowly, like it might burn her. She placed it in Daniel's hand. "I need time and honesty." She walked past me without a word, her dress brushing the pews, leaving behind a trail of shock and whispered questions. The doors closed behind her. I sat back down, suddenly exhausted. Daniel stood alone at the altar. No bride, no vows, just the consequences of choices he thought no one would trace back to him. After a moment, he turned toward me and walked down the aisle. People watched, but they didn't matter anymore. "You planned this," he said when he reached me. "No," I replied. "You did." His eyes were red. "You wanted to humiliate me." "I wanted to separate myself from your decisions. What happened after that was out of my hands." He laughed bitterly. "You always knew how to play the long game." I met his gaze. "I learned from being married to you." Outside, the sunlight was sharp and unforgiving. Mark approached me as guests began to leave in clusters, murmuring, avoiding Daniel's eyes. "I didn't know you'd be here," he said. "I didn't know you'd come," I replied. He nodded. "I just wanted answers. I didn't mean to disrupt anything." "Truth does that," I said. He offered his hand. "Thank you for doing the right thing." I shook it. As I walked back to my car, I felt something lift. Not joy, not revenge, closure. Some stories don't end with forgiveness. They end with clarity. And sometimes that's enough. The days after the wedding that wasn't felt heavier than the day itself. It's strange how consequences don't always arrive with fireworks. Sometimes they settle in quietly, like dust after a door has been slammed, coating everything impossible to ignore. Daniel didn't call me for 3 days. That alone told me more than any confrontation could have. When he finally did, his voice sounded older, worn thin. "They froze my accounts," he said. "No greeting, no accusation, just a statement." I leaned against the kitchen counter, the same one where we'd once argued over paint colors. That was always a possibility. "They're asking questions," he continued, "about the loan, about cash flow." I waited. "And Leela moved out," he added, softer now. I closed my eyes, not in satisfaction, but in something like grief. Not for him exactly, but for the wreckage people leave behind when they lie too long. "I never meant to hurt her," he said. I let the silence stretch. You didn't mean to hurt me either. Intent doesn't erase impact. News travels fast in small communities. By the end of the week, people were calling under the guise of concern, friends we'd shared for decades, distant relatives who suddenly remembered my number. "I heard something happened at the wedding," they'd say, voices careful, hungry. I kept my responses simple, honest but contained. "Daniel made some financial choices," I said. "I stepped away from anything that involved my name." Most people understood more than they admitted. A few didn't. One afternoon, a woman from our old social circle cornered me at the grocery store. She leaned in close, lowering her voice as if we were conspiring. "You know, some people think you could have handled it more discreetly." I smiled politely. "Some people think discretion means silence." She flushed and mumbled something about intentions. I pushed my cart away, hands steady. For the first time in my life, I wasn't interested in being agreeable. Claire came over that weekend. She brought takeout and a seriousness that told me she'd been thinking hard. "I talked to Dad," she said as we unpacked containers onto plates. I nodded. "How is he?" She sighed. "Struggling, financially, emotionally." I didn't respond right away. I waited until we were seated, until the clink of forks faded. "He said you embarrassed him," she added carefully. I met her eyes. "And what do you think?" She hesitated. "I think he embarrassed himself, but he's still my father." I reached across the table and took her hand. "Of course he is, and you're allowed to love him without excusing what he did." Her shoulders relaxed slightly. "I don't want this to make you bitter," she said. I smiled softly. It didn't. It made me honest. That seemed to comfort her more than anything else I could have said. Daniel's business began to unravel in small, unglamorous ways. Suppliers tightened terms, clients asked questions, one contract quietly disappeared. Nothing catastrophic, just the slow erosion that happens when trust evaporates. He called me again, this time asking, not demanding. "Would you consider helping me explain things?" he asked. "You're good at that." I thought of the nights I'd stayed up balancing books while he slept, of the trust he'd spent without asking. "No," I said gently, "I can't." There was anger then, accusations about timing, about revenge. "This isn't revenge, it's boundaries." He hung up. I didn't feel guilty. Leela reached out to me once. It was a message, carefully worded, sent late at night. "I didn't know. I'm sorry. I should have seen the signs." I stared at the screen for a long time before replying. "We all see what we're ready to see," I wrote. "I hope you find peace." She didn't respond after that. I hoped she did. Weeks passed. The house grew warmer again, not in temperature, but in spirit. I rearranged furniture, painted a wall a color Daniel had always hated. I took myself out to dinner one evening, sitting by the window with a book I didn't read, just watched people pass by, each of them carrying stories I'd never know. I realized then that I wasn't angry anymore. I was free. The final conversation with Daniel came unexpectedly. He showed up at the house one afternoon, unannounced. He looked thinner, less sure. "He's not here to fight," he said when I opened the door. I stepped aside and let him in. We sat at opposite ends of the couch, the space between us filled with everything we hadn't said over the years. "You underestimated me," he admitted. "I thought because you were calm, you wouldn't act." I nodded. "Calm isn't the same as weak." He exhaled slowly. "I thought love meant you'd protect me." "Love also means protecting yourself," I replied. He looked around the room. "You've changed things." "Yes," I said, "so they finally fit me." He stood to leave, hesitating at the door. "I hope you're happy," he said. I considered the question. "I'm at peace," I replied, "and that's better." After he left, I stood by the window and watched his car disappear down the street. There was no triumph in it, no satisfaction, just an ending. Some people think justice has to be loud, that it needs witnesses and applause, but sometimes justice is simply refusing to carry what no longer belongs to you. I didn't ruin Daniel's life. I stopped financing his lies, and in doing so, I gave myself something I hadn't had in years: clarity. Healing doesn't arrive all at once. It doesn't knock, it doesn't announce itself with certainty. It seeps in slowly through ordinary moments until one day you realize the ache you've been bracing for never showed up. The first real sign came on a Tuesday morning. I was standing in the kitchen, sunlight cutting across the counter where I'd once sorted Daniel's invoices, when I realized I hadn't thought about him all day. Not once. Not with bitterness, not with curiosity, not even with sadness. Just silence. And for the first time, it didn't scare me. I began rebuilding my life in small, deliberate ways. Not the dramatic kind people expect after a divorce. No sudden reinvention, no declarations about starting over. Just quiet adjustments, honest ones. I joined a morning walking group in the neighborhood. Nothing fancy, just a handful of women and one retired widower who walked too fast and apologized every time someone lagged behind. We talked about weather, sore knees, and sometimes about loss, the way people do when they're not trying to impress anyone. I replanted the garden Daniel had neglected for years, pulled weeds, turned soil, watched my hands get dirty, and felt something grounding in the work. Growth, I learned, requires disturbance first. Inside the house, I let myself change things without asking permission, even imaginary permission. I donated furniture that carried too much history, bought new sheets in a color I liked just because I liked it. At night, I slept deeply. No waiting for footsteps, no bracing for excuses, just rest. Claire visited often, sometimes with stories from work, sometimes just to sit beside me on the couch and exist. One evening, as we folded laundry together, she said, "You know, I think you handled everything with more grace than I could have." I smiled. Grace comes easier when you stop explaining yourself. She considered that. "I'm proud of you," she added. That mattered more than she probably realized. There were moments, of course, when old memories surfaced unexpectedly. A song on the radio, a restaurant we used to love, the smell of rain on hot pavement, always his favorite. But the memories no longer had teeth. They passed through me like weather instead of storms. I didn't romanticize the marriage anymore. I could see it clearly now, the good years and the cracks I'd papered over with patience and practicality. I had confused endurance with love, and I forgave myself for that. A few months after the wedding incident, I received a letter from the bank. Daniel's loan had been restructured, assets liquidated. Mark, the cosigner, had been protected. Daniel had survived, diminished perhaps, but intact. That knowledge brought me relief. I hadn't wanted destruction, I'd wanted separation, and I'd gotten it. The last piece of healing came unexpectedly, in the form of a conversation I didn't plan to have. I ran into Lila at a cafe one afternoon. She looked different, not worse, just quieter, less performative. She hesitated when she saw me, then approached. "May I sit?" she asked. I nodded. We spoke cautiously at first, about neutral things, weather, work. Then she exhaled. "I ignored so many signs," she said. "I thought love meant believing what I was told." I met her eyes. "Love means paying attention." She swallowed. "I'm sorry," I replied. There was no friendship forged there, no dramatic reconciliation, just understanding. And that was enough. As the year turned, I found myself thinking less about what I'd lost and more about what I'd gained: autonomy, clarity, self-trust. I no longer questioned my instincts. I honored them. I no longer softened truths to keep peace. I told them plainly, kindly, and let others decide how to receive them. Most of all, I learned that dignity doesn't come from silence. It comes from alignment between what you know, what you allow, and what you choose. One night, long after everyone else had gone to bed, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea and listened to the quiet hum of the neighborhood. I thought about the woman I'd been when Daniel first said, "There's someone else," how she'd sat so still, absorbing impact without protest. I wished I could reach back through time and tell her this: you will survive the truth. You will not need to punish anyone. You will simply stop carrying what isn't yours, and that will be enough. I stood, turned off the porch light, and went inside. The house felt like mine, not because I'd won anything, but because I'd reclaimed myself. And sometimes that's the most powerful ending there is. There's a kind of quiet that only comes after a long season of noise. Not the empty kind, but the earned kind. The kind that settles in your bones when you no longer feel the need to explain yourself to anyone. That's where I found myself months later, sitting at the same dining table where my life had once been negotiated down to line items and signatures. The table looked different now, not because it had changed, but because I had. I wasn't bracing anymore. I wasn't waiting for another shoe to drop. I wasn't scanning the room for someone else's mood. I was simply there. People sometimes ask me if I regret how things unfolded. They lower their voices when they ask, as if regret is contagious. What if you'd handled it differently, they say. Do you ever feel bad? Wouldn't it have been easier to just let it go? And I always pause before answering, because those questions aren't really about me. They're about fear. Fear of rocking the boat, fear of being labeled difficult, fear of what happens when a woman stops absorbing the cost of other people's decisions. Here's the truth I've come to understand, and I say this gently from the other side of it. Letting go doesn't always mean staying quiet. Sometimes it means stepping back and letting consequences speak for themselves. I didn't expose Daniel. I didn't embarrass him. I didn't orchestrate his downfall. I simply stopped protecting him from the results of his own choices, and the world responded accordingly. That's not cruelty. That's clarity. For a long time, I believed love meant cushioning someone from discomfort, smoothing edges, filling gaps, covering shortfalls, emotional and financial. I believed that if I stayed steady enough, patient enough, useful enough, the relationship would hold. What I didn't understand then was this: when you keep rescuing someone from accountability, you teach them they never have to grow. And when you keep shrinking yourself to keep peace, you teach the world that your needs are optional. That lesson cost me years, but it also gave me wisdom I wouldn't trade for anything. There's a moment I replay sometimes, not with anger, but with awareness. Daniel standing at the altar, the empty space beside him, the truth arriving not with shouting, but with paperwork and witnesses and quiet certainty. People think that moment was the climax. It wasn't. The real turning point happened much earlier, the day I decided I was done carrying what wasn't mine. Everything after that was just physics. If you're listening to this and finding yourself uncomfortable, let me say this with care. Discomfort isn't always a warning. Sometimes it's an invitation to ask yourself, who am I protecting at my own expense? What am I funding emotionally, financially, spiritually that no longer aligns with who I am? What would happen if I simply stepped back? Those aren't easy questions, but they're honest ones. I used to think strength looked like endurance. Now I know it looks like alignment. It looks like your actions matching your values, even when that disappoints people who benefited from your silence, especially then. I don't hate Daniel. That surprises people. But hate would mean I'm still attached to the version of him I hoped he'd be. I've let that go. What I feel instead is something steadier, acceptance. And acceptance doesn't require proximity, permission, or approval. It just requires truth. Life now is quieter but fuller. My laughter comes easier. My decisions don't need a second opinion unless I want one. I trust myself again. And if there's one thing I wish every woman listening could understand, it's this. You don't have to raise your voice to reclaim your power. You don't have to be cruel to be clear. You don't have to destroy anyone to save yourself. Sometimes the most radical act is simply saying, I'm done paying for this. So I'll leave you with this question, and I want you to really sit with it. If you stopped covering for someone today, what truth would finally be free to surface? And would you be strong enough to let it? If this story resonated with you, if it reminded you of a moment you stayed quiet when you shouldn't have, or a boundary you're still afraid to draw, you're not alone. Share your thoughts in the comments. Tell me what you would have done. And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories about truth, dignity, and quiet strength, make sure you subscribe and stay with me. Because sometimes the most powerful stories aren't about revenge, they're about release. And those stories deserve to be told. Time didn't rush in to wrap things up neatly after that. It stretched. It tested. It revealed things that only surface when the dust has settled and people have to live inside the truth they created. Daniel didn't disappear the way people sometimes do after public embarrassment. He stayed. He tried to rebuild in the same town, among the same faces, under the same unspoken understanding that something fundamental had shifted. And I watched, not closely, not deliberately, but inevitably. Because when you share a past with someone, their future echoes around you for a while, whether you want it to or not. The first time I saw him again in a professional setting was at a local Chamber of Commerce meeting I'd attended for work. I hadn't known he'd be there. When I walked in, the room was already half full, chairs scraping against the floor, voices overlapping. I spotted him near the refreshment table, standing alone with a cup of coffee he didn't seem to be drinking. He looked smaller, not physically, but socially. People greeted him politely, briefly. Conversations didn't linger the way they used to. He wasn't ignored exactly, he just wasn't anchored anymore. When our eyes met across the room, he gave a stiff nod. I returned it, then took my seat. We didn't speak, and that strangely said everything. Later that evening, a colleague leaned toward me and whispered, "I didn't know you two were, well." I kept my gaze forward. We were married. She nodded slowly. You handled things with a lot of composure. That word again, composure. People often mistake it for passivity. They don't see the discipline it takes not to lash out, not to explain, not to rewrite history just to soothe someone else's discomfort. Daniel's business continued to contract, but it didn't collapse. That mattered to me. I didn't want him ruined, I wanted him responsible. He downsized, let go of an assistant, moved his operations out of a rented office and into his apartment, took on smaller contracts that paid slower but asked fewer questions. I heard all this through indirect channels, a former client, a mutual acquaintance, a neighbor who thought she was sharing gossip but was really just narrating a consequence. He's doing everything himself now, she said once. Bookkeeping, too. I nodded, stirring my tea. He said he never realized how complicated it all was, she added. I didn't respond, because that realization belonged to him. One afternoon, months later, I received a call from a number I didn't recognize. It was Daniel's lawyer. I wanted to inform you, he said carefully, that Mr. Harris is petitioning to formally sever any remaining shared financial entanglements. I almost laughed. That's fine, I replied. I assumed that was already the case. There's one account, he continued, that requires a final acknowledgement, purely procedural. I said, Send the paperwork. I'll review it. When the envelope arrived, I sat at the dining table and went through every page slowly. There it was, in black and white, confirmation that Daniel alone would assume responsibility for all future liabilities. No more shadows, no more assumptions. I signed, sealed, and sent it back the same day. Claire noticed the change in me before I fully named it myself. "You don't flinch anymore when his name comes up," she said once casually as we cooked dinner together. "I don't?" I asked. She shook her head. "You used to tense up, like you were bracing for something." I considered that. "I think," I said slowly, "I finally trust I won't be pulled back into something I didn't choose." She smiled. "That sounds peaceful." "It is," I said, "but it took work." There was one last confrontation, though it didn't feel like one at the time. It happened in the parking lot of a hardware store, of all places. I was loading bags of soil into my trunk when Daniel's voice came from behind me. "I heard you got promoted." I turned. He stood a few feet away, hands in his pockets, eyes tired but clear. "I did," I said. "That's good," he replied. "You always deserved more credit." I studied his face, really studied it, and realized something quietly profound. He wasn't asking for anything. No apology, no forgiveness, no rescue, just acknowledgement. "Thank you," I said. He hesitated. "I didn't know how much you were doing until I had to do it myself." "I know," I replied. He nodded. "I'm learning." "I hope so," I said. There was a long pause. Then he said, "I don't blame you anymore." I met his gaze. "Good." We parted without tension, without relief, just closure settling where resentment used to live. Later that evening, as I washed my hands in the kitchen sink, I thought about how far things had come. Not because of confrontation, not because of exposure, but because I had stopped intervening. When you stop absorbing the consequences meant for someone else, the world rebalances itself. It always does. The most unexpected shift came from within my own family. An aunt I hadn't spoken to in years called me one night. "I heard what you went through," she said. "I stayed too long in my own marriage, paid too much for someone else's comfort." Her voice cracked. "I didn't know you could just stop." I closed my eyes. "You can," I said, "but it helps to know why you're stopping." We talked for an hour. I realized then that my story had traveled further than I thought, not as gossip, as permission. Daniel's wedding never got rescheduled. That too mattered, not because I wanted his loneliness, but because rushing into new promises without reckoning really never ends differently the second time. Lila, I heard, moved cities, started over. I hoped she learned something from it all. I know I did. There are endings that feel like slamming doors, and then there are endings that feel like doors quietly closing behind you as you walk into a room that finally belongs to you. This was the second kind, and it didn't need an audience, just honesty. There's a strange moment that comes after everything has already happened. After the arguments you didn't have, after the explanations you stopped giving, after the story settles into something people think they understand. It's the moment when nothing is happening and you realize that's the point. That's where I was. My days found a new rhythm, not exciting, not dramatic, just honest. I woke early, not because I had to, but because my body no longer resisted the morning. I made coffee the way I liked it, strong, no sugar, and drank it slowly, watching the sun climb over the neighbor's roof like it had somewhere important to be. At work, I stopped volunteering to fix things that weren't assigned to me, not out of spite, but out of respect for my own energy. People adjusted. They always do. One afternoon, a junior colleague stopped by my office door, hesitating. "Can I ask you something personal?" she said. I gestured for her to sit. "My husband, he keeps making decisions without telling me," she said. "Financial ones. He says it's easier if I don't worry." I felt the familiar tightening in my chest. Not fear, but recognition. "What do you think?" I asked. She stared at her hands. "I think if I don't worry, it's because I don't know." I nodded. "That's not peace," I said gently. "That's exclusion." She swallowed. "What did you do?" I didn't give her instructions. I gave her truth. "I paid attention," I said, "and when my presence became optional, I made my absence permanent." She sat with that for a long moment. Then she thanked me and left. I wondered how many quiet lives were balancing on similar edges. At home, I found myself laughing more. Not loudly, not performatively, just easily. I hosted small dinners, nothing extravagant, soup simmering on the stove, bread warming in the oven, candles lit not for romance, but because the light felt kind. People stayed longer than they used to. Conversation wandered. No one rushed to impress. The house breathed again. There were still moments when the past knocked unexpectedly. A document requiring Daniel's signature, a tax form referencing a year that felt like another lifetime, his name appearing in an email chain I couldn't fully escape. But those moments didn't pull me backwards. They passed through me like echoes, faint, recognizable, powerless. One evening, as I was sorting through old boxes in the basement, I found a folder labeled Harris Logistics, Early Years. Inside were contracts I'd drafted, budgets I'd projected, notes in my handwriting from meetings I barely remembered. I sat on the concrete floor and leafed through them slowly. I saw myself there, capable, meticulous, invisible. I closed the folder and set it aside, not to keep, but to release. The work had already been done. Claire called later that night. "I ran into Dad today," she said. I waited. "He asked how you were," she continued. "I told him you were doing well." "And?" I asked. He smiled, like genuinely. I leaned back in my chair. "I think he's finally understanding something," she added. "What's that?" I asked. "That you weren't the reason his life worked. You were the reason it held together." I closed my eyes. "That's a heavy realization," I said. "For him," she replied, "not for you." She was right. There is a kind of freedom that doesn't come from winning. It comes from being finished. Finished explaining, finished compensating, finished waiting for someone else to catch up to the truth you've been living in quietly. I had reached that place. Months later, I attended a small community panel on women and financial independence. I wasn't scheduled to speak, just to listen. At the end, the moderator asked if anyone wanted to share a personal reflection. I raised my hand before I could talk myself out of it. I stood, heart steady. "I learned," I said, "that money is rarely just money. It's trust, it's power, it's silence or voice." The room was still. And when someone uses your resources without your consent, they're not just spending funds, they're spending you. A few heads nodded. I sat back down, pulse calm. I hadn't planned to say that, but it was true. Later, as I walked to my car under the dim glow of parking lot lights, I felt something settle fully into place. I wasn't defined by what Daniel did, or by how I responded, or by what people thought of either of us. I was defined by what I no longer allowed, and that definition felt solid. Some endings stretch longer than others, not because they're unresolved, but because they teach slowly. This was one of those endings, one that kept unfolding into something quieter, steadier, truer. And for the first time in a very long time, I wasn't waiting for the next chapter. I was living inside it. There's a season after clarity that doesn't get talked about much. It's not dramatic enough for stories, not painful enough for sympathy, not joyful enough for celebration. It's just living with what you now know. That's where I was. The town settled into a new understanding of Daniel and me, one that didn't require constant explanation. People stopped asking questions that were really judgments in disguise. They stopped offering advice I hadn't asked for. The air around my name felt cleaner. At work, the promotion came with responsibility, real responsibility, and I welcomed it. I found satisfaction and competence that wasn't borrowed or shared. When something went wrong, it was mine to fix. When something went right, it was mine to hold. I realized how rarely that had been true before. One afternoon, I received a call from the county clerk's office about an old property filing tied to Daniel's business. The woman on the phone spoke carefully, professionally. "We just need confirmation that you're no longer financially affiliated," she said. "I'm not," I replied. There was a pause as she typed. "All set," she said. "Thank you." I hung up and laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was final. Another small thread cut. Daniel and I spoke less and less, not intentionally, it just happened. When Claire visited him, she told me he seemed quieter, more reflective, less defensive. "He asked me how to balance a budget," she said once, half amused. I smiled, and "I told him to track every dollar," she said. "You would have liked that." I did like that, not because it proved anything, but because it showed he was finally learning instead of outsourcing. The community continued to respond in subtle ways. At a charity event, a woman I barely knew approached me and said, "I watched what you did. It helped me leave something I'd been carrying for years." I didn't ask what. I didn't need to. I just nodded and said, "I'm glad you trusted yourself." That word, trusted, stayed with me. There was a moment, late one evening, when I caught myself wondering if things could have ended differently. If Daniel had told the truth sooner, if he'd asked instead of assumed, if I'd drawn boundaries earlier. But those thoughts didn't spiral. They passed through me like leaves on water. Because the truth was this: we didn't end because of one mistake. We ended because of a pattern. And patterns don't change without interruption. I interrupted mine. The house continued to evolve. I turned the spare room into a small office, mine, fully mine, with shelves that held books I'd always wanted to read and never had time for. I framed certificates I'd once tucked into drawers. I placed a plant near the window and watched it grow toward the light without apology. That plant became something of a symbol to me. No one had to tell it where to lean. One evening, as I watered it, my phone buzzed with a message from an unfamiliar number. It was Daniel. "I wanted to say thank you," it read, "not for what happened, but for not destroying me when you could have." I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I typed back, "I didn't want destruction. I wanted distance." A few minutes passed before his reply came. "I see that now." That was enough. I didn't save the message. I didn't need to. As the year wore on, something unexpected happened. I stopped defining my story around the divorce at all. When people asked about my past, I spoke about my career, my interests, the quiet pleasures I'd rediscovered. Daniel became a chapter, not the plot. That distinction mattered. One weekend, Claire and I took a short trip, nothing elaborate, a small coastal town, long walks, quiet meals. As we sat watching the tide come in, she said, "I think I understand something now." I turned to her. "I thought being strong meant enduring things, but watching you, I think it means knowing when to stop." I felt my throat tighten. Yes, I said, and knowing that stopping isn't failure. She leaned her head against my shoulder. I'm glad you stopped, she said. So was I. There are moments when the past tries to reintroduce itself, not loudly but persistently. A memory triggered by a place, a comment that lands heavier than expected, a question that assumes you're still who you were. But I learned how to respond to those moments. I didn't correct them, I outgrew them. One final piece fell into place near the end of that year. I was invited to speak at a small financial literacy workshop, not as an expert, but as someone with lived experience. At the end, a woman raised her hand. How do you know when it's time to stop supporting someone? She asked. The room was quiet. I considered the question carefully. When support becomes substitution, when help turns into hiding, when your effort replaces their responsibility, I paused, and when you realize the cost is you. She nodded slowly. I saw recognition ripple through the room. Driving home that night, I felt a deep sense of completion, not because everything was perfect, but because it was honest. I thought back to the woman I'd been on the day Daniel said he was leaving, how she'd sat there, calm on the outside, absorbing shock like it was her job. I wished I could tell her something, not to warn her, but to reassure her. This will not break you. It will clarify you. And one day you will wake up in a life that no longer asks you to disappear to keep it running. The road ahead stretched quietly before me, illuminated by headlights and certainty. No drama, no unfinished business, no debts, emotional or otherwise, left unpaid. Just forward motion. And that, I had learned, was more than enough. By the time the next spring arrived, I had begun to notice the subtle ways life rewards honesty, even when it arrives quietly. It wasn't in grand gestures. It wasn't in applause or recognition. It was in the way mornings no longer felt heavy, in the way my own breath carried without the tension of expectation. I woke up without bracing for the next disappointment, and that alone felt revolutionary. Claire had grown into her own sense of clarity as well. One evening, as we were preparing dinner, she looked at me with a seriousness I hadn't seen before. You know, she said, I've been thinking about what you taught me, even without saying it. I paused, knife in hand, chopping vegetables with a rhythm that had long become meditative. What's that? I asked. That strength isn't about enduring everything quietly, she continued. It's about choosing what you carry and what you leave behind. Her words resonated deeply. I set the knife down and reached for hers, squeezing gently. You understand well, Claire, I said, and remember, the weight you choose to carry shapes who you become. Daniel? I thought about him sometimes, less often now. He was no longer a presence in my day-to-day life, not because I had wished it, but because we had grown into separate realities. His mistakes, his reckoning, his learning, they no longer require my participation. I watched from the periphery as he rebuilt, witnessing consequences unfold naturally. I had stopped protecting him. That simple action had been transformative. One afternoon, I found myself reflecting on the chain of small, deliberate decisions that had led me to this point. Cutting the financial ties had been only the beginning. The true journey had been in how I held myself afterward, steady, undistracted, uncompromising in my clarity. I thought about the letters from Mark, the confrontations at the church, the conversations with Claire, the messages from Lila. Each had been a brushstroke, painting the edges of a picture that I could finally view without distortion. And for the first time, I realized something I had been too afraid to acknowledge before. I was proud of myself. Not for revenge, not for exposure, not for humiliation, but for choosing dignity. The community continued to adjust in subtle ways. At a local fundraiser, I was greeted not as Daniel's ex-wife, but as myself, fully, finally. People approached me with genuine curiosity about my work, my life, my opinions. They no longer assumed I was merely a shadow behind someone else's accomplishments. One woman approached me with tears glistening in her eyes. "I watched what you did," she said, "and it gave me courage to step back from something in my life I had been carrying for far too long." I took her hands and smiled gently. "You don't have to carry what isn't yours," I said. "Not forever, not ever." And I meant it. Life had become quieter, but in that quiet there was richness. I started taking early morning walks again, listening to the way birds interacted with the light and the wind, noticing the small details of the world that I had once overlooked in the constant weight of worry. The smell of dew on the grass, the muted hum of distant traffic, the rustle of leaves overhead, these were my companions now, reminders that life moved forward in its own quiet rhythm. At home, I rearranged furniture, painted walls in colors I liked, filled the shelves with books that I hadn't read but always wanted to. Each change was small but deliberate, a declaration that my life was mine. Even my garden, once neglected, became a place of solace. I planted flowers and herbs and watched them grow, quietly, patiently, without interference. In them, I saw a reflection of the life I had cultivated: resilience, patience, and clarity. One evening I received a letter, not from Daniel, not from Lila, not from anyone involved in the past. It was a woman I didn't know personally, someone who had attended one of my talks on financial independence and personal boundaries. "Your story gave me courage," the letter read. "I realized I've been carrying too much for others, and I'm finally learning to say no." I held the letter for a long moment, feeling warmth and quiet pride. It wasn't the acknowledgement of others that mattered, it was the proof that actions rooted in honesty ripple beyond intention. Months later, Daniel attempted in his subtle, awkward way to reconcile some remaining paperwork regarding his debts. His lawyer reached out, and the matter was handled efficiently. We never spoke personally. We didn't need to. The closure had happened long before, in that moment at the church, in the quiet decisions afterward, in the understanding that my life no longer depended on anyone else's behavior. Even Lila reached out once more, a brief, careful message. "I hope you're well. I finally understand." I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel the need to respond. Instead, I felt the stillness of acknowledgement, a recognition that the past had been seen, the lessons learned, and life moved on. Claire and I often sat on the porch in the evenings, the same porch where I had watched the world begin to feel safe again. She asked questions about life, love, responsibility, and boundaries, questions that revealed her growing wisdom. "You know," she said, sipping her tea, "I think the hardest part is knowing that some people can't see the truth until it's too late." I nodded. "Yes," I said, "and that's why the most important person to honor is yourself." She smiled, resting her head on my shoulder. "I'm proud of you, Mom." I felt something well up quietly, the kind of deep, unspoken satisfaction from knowing you've done right, not for recognition, not for revenge, but simply because it was necessary. There were no grand gestures, no dramatic epiphanies. Life simply continued, and I continued within it, steady, present, fully myself. The house, the garden, the work, the mornings, all reminders that the choice to honor oneself carries its own rewards, even when no one else sees it, even when no one else acknowledges it, because you do. I learned a quiet truth. Happiness isn't found in others' validation, nor in the outcome of their mistakes. It's found in your own alignment, when your actions, your boundaries, and your choices match who you truly are. And that, I realized, is more powerful than any moment of revenge, more lasting than any public consequence, more fulfilling than any vindication. It's the kind of peace that doesn't announce itself, it just exists. As I sit now, thinking about the journey, the betrayal, the heartbreak, the consequences, and the healing, I see that each step, each quiet act of courage mattered because I chose myself, because I honored my boundaries, because I let the world adjust to the truth rather than trying to control the outcome. And that choice, above all, freed me. Life, I learned, doesn't require closure in the way people imagine. It requires clarity. It requires attention to what is yours to carry and what belongs to someone else. It requires patience, courage, and faith that the consequences of truth will unfold as they should. And when you finally allow yourself to live there fully and unafraid, the world settles into a new rhythm, quieter, steadier, honest. I sit on the porch now, tea in hand, watching the sun dip low across the horizon. The air smells faintly of rain and flowers. The leaves rustle softly in the evening breeze. I smile quietly to myself because I am here, because I am free, because I chose dignity, truth, and peace, and in doing so, I discovered the most profound form of strength. And that, my friends, is where the story truly ends. Before I finish this story, I want to speak directly to you. I want you to hear the words as if I were sitting across from you in the quiet of a living room with a cup of tea between us, because this isn't just a story about me. It's about all of us, about the quiet battles we fight in relationships, in families, in our own hearts. When Daniel left me for Leela, I could have let bitterness define me. I could have screamed, accused, or plotted. I could have let anger take over my life. But I didn't. I made a different choice. I chose boundaries. I chose clarity. I chose myself. And you know what I realized? Choosing yourself doesn't mean you hate anyone else. It doesn't mean you want their life to collapse. It doesn't mean you're cruel. It simply means you recognize what is yours to carry and what isn't. Too many of us are conditioned to absorb the costs of other people's mistakes. We cover for them, we apologize for them, we fix problems that aren't ours, and in doing so, we shrink ourselves, slowly, quietly, without noticing. But freedom, real freedom, comes when you stop doing that. I want you to imagine a life where you no longer pay for someone else's choices, where you no longer feel responsible for repairing someone else's mistakes, where you stop shrinking to make someone else comfortable. Can you feel that? The space it creates? The relief that comes when you finally stop absorbing what isn't yours? That space is powerful. It's quiet, yes, but it's revolutionary. Now, I want to tell you something about consequences. Daniel's life didn't collapse. It didn't explode in front of everyone. There were no fireworks, no dramatic reveal. And yet, consequences unfolded, slowly, quietly, naturally. His finances tightened, his reputation subtly shifted. He had to confront the reality of his decisions. He had to take responsibility for the choices he'd made without my intervention. Justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it simply lets the truth settle into the cracks that were already there. And you don't have to orchestrate it. You don't have to micromanage it. You don't have to prove anything. You just have to step back, honor yourself, and let life do the rest. That's the lesson I learned, one I wish I'd understood decades ago. I also want to speak to forgiveness. Not the kind that erases wrongs, not the kind that requires reconciliation, but the kind that frees you. I forgave Daniel in my heart, not because he asked, not because he deserved it, but because I didn't want anger to live in me any longer. Forgiveness isn't about letting someone else off the hook. It's about releasing the weight they never asked you to carry. And when you forgive in that way, Peace follows, slowly, quietly, fully. Here's the truth I want you to take with you. You are not responsible for someone else's choices. You are not obligated to absorb the fallout of their mistakes. You are allowed to draw lines, to say no, to step back. You are allowed to protect your heart. I want to ask you a question, and I want you to sit with it. If you stopped covering for someone today, what truth would finally be free to surface? Would you be strong enough to let it? Would you let yourself finally breathe? Would you step fully into your own life, unafraid of the consequences? My life after Daniel isn't perfect. I still face challenges. I still navigate relationships, responsibilities, and the small crises life throws at all of us. But I do it on my own terms now. I wake up in a home that feels like mine. I walk through days that feel like choices, not obligations. I make decisions that honor me, and I no longer apologize for it. And that, my friends, is a kind of victory that no one can take away. So if there's one thing I hope you remember from my story, it's this. Power doesn't come from control. Strength doesn't come from enduring quietly. Freedom doesn't come from revenge. Power, strength, and freedom come from clarity, honesty, and the courage to honor yourself, even when it means letting others face the consequences of their own choices. And if you're here listening, maybe you need to hear this for yourself. Maybe there's someone in your life whose choices you've been covering for, someone whose actions you've been paying for with your energy, your peace, your sanity. It's okay to step back. It's okay to say no. It's okay to stop carrying what isn't yours. That's not cruelty. That's wisdom. So I leave you with this gentle challenge. Look at your life. Look at the people around you. Look at the weight you've been carrying that doesn't belong to you. Would you be brave enough to set it down? Would you be brave enough to reclaim your life? Would you finally honor yourself? If my story resonated with you, if it reminded you of a boundary you need to draw, a truth you need to face, or a freedom you need to claim, share it. Share it in the comments, with a friend, or just with yourself. Speak it aloud, if only for your own heart. And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories about truth, courage, and quiet strength, subscribe and stay with me. Because sometimes the most powerful acts aren't loud or dramatic. Sometimes the most powerful acts are the quiet ones, the ones that honor your life, the ones that honor your truth, the ones that finally let you be free. And now, I ask you one last time, if you stopped carrying what isn't yours, what would your life look like tomorrow? Would you have the courage to find out? That, my friends, is true strength begins. And that is the end of this story.